Tranquility du Jour, August 13th, 2018. Hello there, this is Kimberly Wilson, and welcome to the 427th edition of Tranquility du Jour, a podcast featuring artists, activists, and authors. Today we're chatting with Christianne Squires, who I met at a writing retreat in Ojai, California a few years ago. And she has a business called Bookwifery. And in this week's edition, we discuss the trimesters of book pregnancy, so creative, what discernment is and how to use it, her advice to stuck writers, and more. Also, if you're new to Tranquility du Jour, there's a link in the show notes, which can be found at kimberlywilson.com/blog that will provide all sorts of information about Tranquility du Jour and how to learn more, how to find out more resources. Ideally, what we're hoping is more tranquility in your life. Save the date. September 23rd is our next Tranquility du Jour live. And although we're still in the middle of summer, just wanted to make sure everyone has that on their calendar. And of course, it's a free 1-hour event that I do seasonally. Just a little way to touch base with the community and to provide some tips kind of based on the season on ways to find a little more tranquility in the everyday. In addition to the Tranquility du Jour Live, we have Year of Tranquility, which is ongoing. This month's focus and module is self-care. Next month is mindfulness. Then there's writing, entrepreneurship, and meaning. And you can drop in on any of these, and the link to that is in the show notes, and it's kimberlywilson.com/YOT. Also, October 20th, we have our next virtual retreat. It's a Saturday. We'd love to have you join us for that. It's a really sweet event. And we also have a live audience that will be here with us from the Pink Palace. And next retreat. So just finished penning in Paris, as you know, and it was such a wonderful, wonderful time. And of course, there's a blog post all about that. And it's, it was just really special. It's fun to see people expressing their writing dreams and also to see those who have been in the past and to see what they have accomplished since we were last together. And there's something about Paris, I think, that just really evokes and brings up this desire to learn more about ourselves and to dive deeper into the creative process. So the next retreat I'm leading is in West Virginia right before Halloween. And that's October 26th through the 28th. And then next year, the two international retreats are Costa Rica and Tuscany in July. And we'll be back for penning in Paris, probably in 2020 will be the next one. So if you're interested, stay tuned over at Tranquility du Jour for all that information. Now, without further ado, Christianne Squires. She's the founder of Bookwifery, a company that helps contemplatives, teachers, and leaders birth books that heal the world with light. She supports fledgling authors in this way through her book pregnancy-themed online courses, her popular free workshop that helps people discern if they are pregnant with a book, and the recently launched Bookwifery podcast. She worked in publishing and editorial for nearly 20 years and as a spiritual director for nearly 10, and says it is her great delight to have merged those two vocations into the work she does at Bookwifery. She's active on Instagram. There's a link to that, of course, in the show notes, and lives in Winter Park, Florida with her husband, Kirk, and their two cats, Aslan and Lucy. So in the show notes, there's a link to find Christine on Facebook, Instagram, her website, bookwifery.com, her new podcast, and her online courses. And having worked with Christianne and again met her a couple years ago in Ojai, California, she's just a really lovely, sweet, generous spirit. So definitely check her out. I think you'll find her to be quite enlightening and also comforting. Welcome, Christianne.
Thanks so much for having me, Kimberly. It's great to be here.
It's such a treat to have you. And I am so curious since, you created this really cool business that continues to evolve, and I'm loving it. And it's called Bookwifery. And so I assume that you spend some time kind of figuring out, okay, like, what do I call this business I'm going to be creating? How do I help people, feel like this is a joint process and I'm taking them through something like as intense as, possibly creating a baby? And so tell us a little bit about your baby, Bookwifery, and how this came to be.
Thank you so much. Yes, this, a lot of times, like you said, it's still evolving, and I feel like every once in a while I have conversations with people about what I'm doing, and they say, it sounds like, Bookwifery is still being birthed. And it's like, yeah, it is. It's still becoming what it wants to be as well. And so it kind of it was a surprise to me the way that it developed. I had been working in editorial and freelance for probably 16 or 17 years when 3 different friends approached me separately from each other over the course of like a year and a half and said, and asked if I could work with them and be their editor on their book projects. And the thing that was unique about each of those experiences was that they wanted me to work with them kind of from the very beginning of the process, or just they'd already started a little bit, but I was diving in and into the creative process almost from the beginning with them and seeing it all the way through to completion. And all of the work I had done prior to that had been, working inside publishing houses or as a contract editor for publishing houses, that they already had the books under contract and then they're coming through production either in-house or sent out to me as a contractor. And it's like I had very minimal experience with the author prior to seeing their finished manuscript and starting to work on it. So I absolutely loved the experience of working with these 3 friends/clients from the beginning of the process, and like discovering what this book is even trying to become and what's the best format and what's going to be their publishing path, and like their dreams for this book. I mean, it was such an intimate experience, and it really aligned well with another professional path I had been walking for about 10 years by that point, which was working in spiritual direction and spiritual formation, where I do a lot of discernment work and helping people pay attention to the invitations in their life and how are they responding. And there was just such a great marrying there between my editorial background and then my discernment and spiritual direction background, and working with these 3 individuals over the course of like a year and a half. I was like, this is like the perfect way to blend what I do, the 2 big parts of who I am in the world. And so, the Bookwifery metaphor, using the birthing and pregnancy and midwifery, it kind of came randomly while I was on a bike ride, and I was kind of seeing it floating in front of my eyes, this phrase like midwife of word and soul. And it was just that moment again of crystallizing, okay, the 2 professional paths of my life are both kind of joined in this metaphor of midwife, helping birth something, birthing the soul, birthing words, birthing books. That's how it came to be.
I love it. And I love too that you've already used at the start of our podcast, discernment. And this is one of the words whenever I met you, right, at Christine Mason Miller's writing retreat, 2 years ago. Yep. Somehow I think that even came up then. And I was like, gosh, that's such a good word. And so you talk a lot about the importance of it. So can you share with our listeners, A, how you define it, and B, how you encourage people to practice it?
Yeah. So I think of discernment as different than decision making. Like there's all these decisions we have to make in our life, and it's like some of them we just make in split seconds, and some of them we have to like weigh out our pro and con list, and picking a job, making a move, looking at a relationship, those kinds of things. But discernment has kind of more of a spiritual component to it. It has a couple different factors that I identify in it. One is a belief in like presence or the holy or the sacred or some entity, some being, the universe, God, however you might name it, that there is some kind of presence separate from ourselves, or even maybe inside of us that is still kind of different than us, that is kind of awake and actively participating in our lives with us, and that there's like a partnership going on there. And I know that's not for everyone. So I'll just say, like, that's fine. But I do try to honor the way people might name what that entity is for them and let them, however their beliefs around that, evolve. But kind of what I take as kind of a starting point for discernment is a belief in some kind of presence other than ourselves that is, what's the word I'm looking for? Like affective, like has our good at heart, is seeking to partner with us in life and engage us. And so that's one element of discernment. And so when I say discernment, it's like tuning in to like the conversation that's happening between us and that entity. And how are we? And so I talk a lot about invitations as well, or noticing. Those are other words that crop up a lot in my conversations. And it's, what are we noticing and how is it inviting our path? What are we being invited to respond to? And then the other piece about discernment that I love to explore with people is how you uniquely discern. And so I've noticed in my work in spiritual direction and spiritual formation is that people have kind of unique inner ways of knowing what they know is true for them, is right for them, what their connection to the divine or the holy looks like, or the sacred. Like some people connect to that sense of godness out in nature, and other people, it's like being in a sacred space, a place. Some people it's through prayer. Some people it's through community and conversation or activism. And there's like these different places that we each feel a sense of connection to that bigness. And so for me, working in discernment with people is about like finding out what that like language looks like for them and letting that be a place they can access to do their discernment work. So it's not like it looks the same for everyone. Like ways that I discern for my life look different than ways my best friend might discern for her life. But it's like learning what that language and that landscape looks like for each of us, and then having that as a resource and a touchstone to go to when we are trying to discern something. It's a little bit woo, I know.
Yeah, right. Because I'm like, okay, what's the 5-step process? And it's like, there is no 5-step process.
I would say like one great place to start with discernment is to like start to do a little bit of a personal inventory of like, where are those moments in your life where you have known something without a doubt was for you? Like, yes, what does your yes feel like, and what has a no felt like? And so like getting in touch with that feeling of your inner knowing, and also doing another personal catalog of your life to say like, where have I had those moments that I just knew something was beyond, like, and I felt like I was touching something spiritual or numinous, and like, are there any patterns for you in those life moments where you felt like a sense of inner knowing, or those moments where you felt a sense of connection to the spiritual or the sacred, and like starting to notice like, oh, this might be my way. And so I can like tune into that when I'm trying to discern something and say like, are those elements present, or can I go access that somehow? And so it's not like a 5-step process, but it's at least a way of like starting to learn your way, is to kind of look at the past in order to inform the present and the future.
Yeah, beautifully said. I think that's such a great reminder of like, looking for patterns and what have you, and thinking of like, oh, when did I have those moments where like, I had an aha, or I was able to get clear on something, and what was I doing? How do I replicate it?
Exactly. Yep.
Now tell us about the trimesters of book pregnancy.
Yeah, so I go deep into this metaphor. It's very fun for me. And I will just say full disclosure, like I'm not a parent. I'm not I haven't birthed a child myself. So I feel very aware of that tension in the work that I do, but I still dive deep into the birthing metaphor. And I've broken out my courses into first trimester, second trimester, third trimester. And even like before anyone even like gets into the trimester process, I offer a discernment workshop that kind of helps them answer the question whether they're pregnant with a book or not. We call that kind of like a pregnancy test moment, and whether conception has taken place, and is something really trying to be born through you. And once the book comes into the world, we call that delivery, and there's postnatal care of the author. And so there's like all this metaphor stuff going on, which is really fun to tease out. And so I think what I would, and for the purposes of our conversation today, what would be maybe most helpful is just to talk maybe a little bit briefly about each of the trimesters and how I see the connection to what's happening in human pregnancy at that time and how it connects to the book's development. So in the first trimester, one of the things that's happening is like all the cells are multiplying, right? Once the conception happens, it's like doubling and doubling and doubling and becoming bigger and bigger and starting to become like a shape of a human form. And so in book pregnancy, what's happening there, one of the aspects that's happening there as an example is when we're working on the book, we are starting to just create a whole catalog of ideas for the book. Like there's no rhyme or reason to it yet. It's just like getting all the ideas from different vantage points out on paper and then starting to find a little bit of, create some order out of the chaos, starting to find a little bit of structure. So by the end of the first trimester, what you have is what I call the skeleton structure of the book. You kind of have a sense of like, what's here, what goes where, but you haven't put any flesh or organs to it yet. You just have a sense of like, this is what the book will hold. And then in the second trimester, that's where, the 20-week ultrasound happens in human pregnancy, which is like the major ultrasound where you learn, like, is this pregnancy healthy? What is the sex? You're starting to, like, all the major organs are there. And so what I liken that to in book pregnancy in the second trimester is you're working towards the book proposal. And that's where you've really started to put some flesh on the bones and the organs have been developing where the target market for this book, who the audience is, you've written some sample chapters, you've been building your platform and you started to develop a marketing plan for the book. And so there's all of this like greater development and like girth starting to take shape. And then in the third trimester is, in human pregnancy, that's when all of the specific detail is coming into focus. You've got hair starting to grow in, you've got fingernails, eyelashes, like all the little details. And that's in book pregnancy when production happens. The book is getting an official title, it's getting a cover design, it's getting back cover copy. The layout is happening on the page. And so you're starting to see what it looks like. So that's kind of like a very sweeping generalization of some of the big things that happen in each trimester, but that's how I've broken it down to align the metaphor.
Yeah, I love it. It's so creative. It's quite clever.
It's fun. It's just such a rich metaphor. And so I feel like I'm still always learning from it. Like I'll be in a session with one of my students and they'll be talking about something and we'll hit on like another way of thinking about where they are in their development process. Like, oh, this feels like an ultrasound moment where we're starting to get a look at like the little face is starting to show itself, and so, yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like, as you were describing this, I was like, oh, it could even be business-wifery. I mean, there's all sorts of ways, right? Whenever we bring anything creative into the world, it is like this process of birthing and, and having a very long pregnancy that's way beyond 9 months for some of us, Yeah,
exactly. Like I definitely am quick to say that book pregnancy does not kind of follow the timeline of a human pregnancy. It's definitely going to be longer than 9 months, but certainly that feeling, I know talking to lots of mothers in my life who have felt like by the time they got to 40 weeks, they were so ready to be done. And it's like, just get this baby out of me. And will it ever be done? And I think it's very similar to what authors are feeling by the time they get to the end of production. I mean, they've been working and gestating on this book for so long and all the different phases it had to go through to become something. It's like, when is this book going to be done?
Yes, I totally know.
Yeah, you've been there times.
Oh my God. Well, one of the things is on Instagram, you have this beautiful, you have a great Instagram account. Listeners, be sure to check the show notes so that you can check her out. Lots of kitties, lots of books. And then you have Why We Need Your Light and How to Start Shining It. So can you speak to that? Like, I think a lot of listeners, well, so many people, right, feel that there's a book inside of them. And so what is it that makes you feel that we need to hear what everyone has to say?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's been a really exciting development with Bookwifery just in the last few months for me, is to realize what my mission ultimately is here is to help birth books that heal the world with light. And it's been such a great discovery because it's like, okay, I have this thing that I do with people where I help them birth their books. And it's like such a concrete thing that we do together. And yet this kind of healing the world with light kind of brings all of our gaze up a little bit from like the actual work and saying like, no, we're part of something big and important here that the world is needing, more light. And it just makes it feel like we're all in this together. We're all helping in our own unique way. And so when I talk about that, the way it happened was I was, you being a business owner, you know how this is. Like you're continuously trying to refine, like who is this for? Like what I'm doing, who is like it ideally suited for? And so one way that I try to answer that question occasionally for myself is I look at the people I'm actually serving and I say like, what do they have in common? Looking at the people who seem to be really taking a hold of what I'm doing and like what I'm offering to them, and they're like taking it and they're in stride and they're really like being successful in the way that like I was intending it to be and maybe even beyond that. And I'm like, what can I learn about what they all have in common that's teaching me about who this is really for? And so when I did that one day, I was looking at a bunch of students in one of my courses and I'm like, man, they are just amazing souls. They are doing healing work in the world in just very unique ways. One of them working with victims of sexual violence, one of them working with the healing and recovery of memories, one of them helping people find how to become friends with themselves and with God, another person talking about how to navigate cancer diagnoses, another person working with people who have been have had experience with the horrible experience of mass shootings in our nation. So these are like people who I look at and I'm like, you're all light bearers. Like you are going to some places that are often really dark or confusing and you're bringing some light and you're helping people in that context in a way that like you're uniquely suited to do. And so it just helped me realize that this what I do is helping people who have light to bring into the world, helping them learn how to bring it more places, like which is what a book and the development of your audience for your book really helps you do.
I think particularly as you have kind of navigated your direction with general nonfiction. I mean, that's such a great way. I mean, of course we can do it through fiction and, memoir, but there's something about nonfiction that's so like how-to-y or, yes, what have you, that I think really kind of helps, with bringing that forth, like showing here's how.
Yeah, because I mean, I love reading all the categories. Like I love reading fiction. I love reading memoir. I love reading general nonfiction. And I know that we can like learn and be impacted by all of those categories of books. But I did choose to focus on general nonfiction because it's very much, it's direct to the reader. It's saying like, how can I help you? Like I like to call the category of general nonfiction books that help people. And it's not to say that novels and memoir don't help people. They do. But they're primarily focused on telling a story and telling it beautifully and well. And the helping of the reader is kind of like a byproduct of that. But the general nonfiction is like, no bones about it. We're here to help you learn something, grow in some way, access some new part of your life. And so it's just a very much like, yes, we're here to help you. And that is a form of light.
And you also mentioned 3 approaches to writing your general nonfiction book. And, I think our listeners, even if they're interested in writing fiction or memoir, that there'll probably be something that they can take away from these 3 approaches. So could you share a little more about these?
Thanks for asking that question. Okay, so 3 approaches to writing general nonfiction. I'll just say what they are really quickly and then tell a little bit more about each one. The first is to go it alone. And like just write the whole book. The second is to DIY your approach. And that is to do a bunch of research and kind of learn your way through it. And then the third is to follow a prescribed path. And so, okay, the first one where it's like, put your head down, go into writing mode and just write the dang thing, is I think the most popular approach, because once you feel like you have an invitation to write a book, it's like the thing to do is to write the book. And so you kind of go and sit at your desk and you say every morning at 5 a.m., I'm going to write for an hour on my book. And it's just, it feels like in an adventure that is so big and like you can't control so many variables, it becomes the thing that you know to do. And so that's where most people start. The challenge with that is that they tend to keep their eyes on the paper, but not attend to the other pieces of book publishing that are just as important, which is surveying the landscape of what other books are being published on your topic so that you know what's being said already and how your book uniquely fits into that conversation. And that's what helps make you marketable to a publisher. Another aspect of it is platform and audience cultivation. And, how are you growing your audience so that a publisher feels comfortable partnering with you on your book because they know you are someone that other people are already listening to and trust and would be a ready and receptive audience for your book. And so the kind of hunker down and write it approach, that first approach, is like super amazing because of the discipline that it requires, but it also it turns a blind eye to some of these other pieces that are an important part of the process. And so I always worry about someone who comes to me and says, like, I wrote 80,000 words. And I'm like, that's great, but there's still other pieces that are important to now do. And you're not ready to move forward yet. Okay, so that's approach number one. Number two is to DIY your way through it. And that is where, you might feel like, okay, yeah, there are these other things I need to attend to while I write my book. And I'm going to go and do the research and learn about all of that and kind of create a path for myself. And so you might read books or blogs or take some online courses that help you fill in some of the blanks of what do I need to be doing? But you kind of chart your own course. You create your own path and you're like, okay, I'm aware that there's more than the book here that needs to be done. There's all these other pieces and things I need to be aware of and attending to and figuring out the timing on. And I'm just going to educate myself and then start to create a plan. And I love that approach. I'm a total DIYer myself as a business owner. As a learner, I tend to be just let me gather resources and then figure it out and create a plan for myself. And so I say that works best for people who are self-starters and intrinsically motivated, like to learn, like to kind of teach themselves and then chart their own course. And then the third approach is to follow a prescribed path. And this is where, this is what I do at Bookwifery, is provide courses for each of the trimesters that kind of serve as a guide and give you a path to follow, help you know the timing of things, educate you on things as you need to know them, keep you accountable to the process. So this is great for folks who don't want to have to do all the research of all the things and figure it out all on their own, but they want to be able to trust someone who is like a guide for them and also provides some guardrails and some accountability so they keep moving forward. So if you don't feel like you're great at self-starter setting goals and figuring out how to reach them yourself, and you need someone to kind of set them for you and keep you accountable to it, then following a prescribed path is the great option for you.
Yeah, and there's a great book, listeners, and I'm sure that you're very familiar with this, Christianne. It's How to Write a Book Proposal by Michael Larson, which is a great place to start, right, if you're writing a general nonfiction book.
Yeah, and that's another thing I'm glad you mentioned that, because with the first approach I mentioned, where you just hunker down and write it and kind of push your way through all the pages, another thing that's challenging for me when someone comes to me with a finished manuscript is to say, well, actually, for general nonfiction, you only need to have a couple sample chapters. The main thing is you need to be working on a book proposal. And, writing the full manuscript is an amazing thing to do, but it's not necessary to do all that work before you actually sell the book to a publisher. So yeah, the proposal is that big thing that's really the important thing at this point.
Right. And I think that's so shocking or confusing to people because, they're like, oh, I figure I should write the book. And I'm like, no, stop.
Yeah.
It's like
get your head around what the book is about and trying to be, and your vision for it and your sense of what you're offering to the reader and to the world through it. Yeah, it's an important thing to do, and it's very counterintuitive. And I think about this a lot because since I've chosen general nonfiction as a place to specialize rather than creative nonfiction or fiction, I've really started to notice the difference between the pathways forward for publishing for those different categories, but also the temperament of the writer is so different, and when we think about writing a book and we think about being a writer, we tend to think of the artistic temperament of going to a cabin in the woods and doing a retreat and, just hunkering down and being with my words all the time. And that's that impulse of I just need to sit down and write it and write it really well. And I think a memoirist or a novelist definitely has to take that path because they do have to write their full book before they ever go anywhere else with it. But for general nonfiction, it's much more pragmatic. It's much more like, what's the vision here? What's the marketability? What's, who are you trying to help? Like, and what's your authority to help those people? And so it's definitely just more like, you have to kind of start to plan it and like envision and, market, like think in sales and marketing terms. And it's not very sexy and it's not very like romantic, but it's definitely the way forward for general nonfiction.
Yeah. It's like your business plan for your book.
Exactly. Yes. That's exactly what it is, which is exciting to me because I love entrepreneurship. And it's just fun to me that by having chosen to specialize in general nonfiction, I get to help people birth books, but I'm also very much helping them really figure out like, what is your work in the world and how are you doing that? And how are you reaching people beyond the pages of the book? It's like, so it really is about helping them almost become small business owners in their own way, or helping them establish their brand. And so it's very entrepreneurial, which is so fun for me.
Yeah, which is creative. But, I think for a lot of people, it feels like, oh no, writing the book is creative. But, this, as you said, it just helps you get so clear. I mean, I always like to tell people it took me longer to write my first book proposal for Hip Tranquil Check than it did to write the book. Because once you do the book proposal, I mean, it takes so much thinking, from your marketing plan to, reviewing the comparable and competitive books. I mean, there's just so much that goes into it. Then, of course, writing your sample chapters. But, once you've got, and the chapter summaries, hello. But once you've got that, it's like, once a publisher picks it up, it's somewhat, quote unquote, smooth sailing to write it.
Yeah, you've done so much internalization of what you're trying to do with this. And you, like you said about the chapter summaries, it's like, you've mapped out where this book is going, and it's just a matter of then writing it to the plan. But it's a very backward way of thinking for most new writers. It's a backward way of thinking about it because, again, like we've been talking about, you think I'm going to write a book and that means I need to sit down and just start writing it. But without a plan, without any intention behind it, without any awareness of all these other things that need to happen, it's like, oh no, wait, stop, come back.
Right. Well, and let me ask you this. What would you say, considering all the time you spent within the industry and the work that you're doing, what advice would you have for aspiring writers, for our listeners, and stuck writers? And I know it's probably two different sorts of advice, or it may be the same.
Okay, so aspiring writers, and again, I want to kind of differentiate between categories. If you're going the route of like, fiction or creative nonfiction, memoir, then the path forward for you is definitely going to be learning the craft. That is very much focused on elements of storytelling, learning how to be deft with your prose and revise. And so like, my pathway forward for you would be to like learn the craft. For those wanting to go in the direction of general nonfiction, which again, I describe as books that are directly trying to help people in some way. I think aspiring writers, I would, probably one place to start is with some kind of a book like what you mentioned by Michael Larson about writing a book proposal and starting to learn what's involved in this process. But also, I think it's important to get in touch with your sense of mission and your sense of authority and the work that you're doing in the world, like that is really motivating your desire to write a book. So what is it that your book is even going to be about? Who is it going to be for? How does this fit into the work that you're doing in your world? Is it going to somehow broaden your message or put everything that you're teaching and guiding other people to do in a certain context in like a packaged way that like helps you be able to put it all together? Like, what's the motivation here and how does it fit into the whole landscape of what you're doing in your life? Because that's really what I see motivating people who are writing general nonfiction is like, you're doing some kind of work in the world. You're a helper, you're a healer, you're a teacher, you're a guide. You have some vocational expertise and training and wisdom, lived experience that you're like, I want to somehow put this in a shape or a package that can help more people than I'm able to do just in my daily life or my work. And so I think it's in terms of aspiring writers, just getting a sense of like, what is this work that you're doing? What is it that a book is going to do for your work that you can't do otherwise? So yeah, and then what was the second question?
Stuck writers. And you may feel, or you may know why I would be asking such a thing.
So one thing I encourage my students to do in our process of working together is getting clearer and clearer and clearer on who their ideal reader is, like who are they writing this book for, and choosing someone specific that they have known in their life. And maybe it's even a younger version of themselves. And just picturing that person to write to as possibly one way to unlock the stuckness. It's very paralyzing to think about writing to the people, capital P, but writing to a person can sometimes loosen us up a little bit and feel like less scary on the page. Another thing that I talk to my students about is spending some time with the stuckness and getting curious about it. What is stopping the flow right now? And starting to have a conversation with that. Is it fear? Is it doubt? Is it not knowing what to do next? And then once you're aware of what is causing the stoppage, starting to problem solve with that. Like, what can I be doing? Am I stuck because I don't have time? Well, what can I be doing about the time? Am I stuck because I don't know what to do? Okay, who can I talk to, or what resources can I go to that would help me know what my next step might be? So those are some ideas that come immediately to mind.
Perfect. Thank you. And you have a podcast you've recently launched. So can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, I've been wanting to do a podcast for like 3 or 4 years now. I'm so happy. I just did episode 6 this week. So it's still a baby podcast. It's called the Bookwifery podcast. It's available in all the places that you can listen to podcasts. And what I'm trying to do each week is some kind of either practical or inspirational support. So I talk about at Bookwifery, I'm helping you birth not just your book, but also your voice and your audience. So the podcast will be some practical different ways of approaching your book, your voice, and your audience. But also the way that I do it is that, with discernment and companionship and guidance. That's really what I'm here to offer you as your creative and spiritual midwife of your book. And so also bringing in some of those kind of spiritual elements, inspirational elements to like, why are we doing this? How can I support your spirit in your process of working on your book? So yeah, I'd love for people to check it out. It's been a lot of fun. I really love it.
And listeners, I'll definitely have a link to it in the show notes. So yeah, check it out. I did some listening last night and I was very impressed.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a great project to be doing.
So my last question for you is, the name of this podcast is Tranquility du Jour, right? So this is an idea of how do we experience tranquility in our everyday? And I interview artists, authors, activists, all sorts of people. And, everyone has a different idea. So I'm curious for you, what is your go-to to try to find pockets or moments of tranquility in your daily life?
Well, one thing I'm looking at right now is I lit a candle before we started our call, because that's one way that I find a sense of peace and centering is when I'm going into a conversation that means something to me, I'll light a candle. Just helps me remember like that sense of light and connection to the light inside of me and the light in the sacred. It's very important to me to turn off at the end of the day and really protect my evenings and my weekends for rest and connection with my significant other and in our home. And so, living in day type compartments, like in accordance with my own creatureliness, like I have a tendency to like try to burn the candle at both ends. And so in this season, I've been really being intentional about not doing that and like honoring the limits of my human body and my mind. And so shutting down the computer and really letting myself enter into our living room space for the night, that feels very restful to me right now in this season, whether it's reading a book or watching Netflix or doing a cross stitch puzzle or something very nerdy like that. Those are places where I'm finding rest right now.
Beautiful. And I think that's such a great reminder, right, of stepping away from time to time, even if you're super passionate about what you're doing, because your mind really does need that reset.
Yeah, if I go through a weekend where I worked on a project on Saturday and Sunday, by Tuesday of the next week, I am like I'm not good for anything. And so I really need to honor like my limits as a human and really rest, because it's what helps me sustain what I'm trying to do in the world.
Well, thank you so much for what you are doing in the world and for being with us here today.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Kimberly. It's been a treat.
So for anyone new to Tranquility du Jour who's not yet on the mailing list, you can sign up for Love Notes, KimberlyWilson.com/Love Note. And that gives you access to Tranquil Treasures, which is a library filled with tools to find tranquility in every day, from MP3s to videos to PDFs. Also, you can find me posting away on Instagram. Recently shared a lot of images from my new therapy office, which I'm in love with. I've been subletting for a year and a half, so it's so sweet to have my own and to be able to decorate it. Then also, I'm on Pinterest, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Again, like Christianne, Instagram is kind of my platform of choice, so you'll find lots of images and kind of updates over there. Also, Tranquility, my locally sewn eco-friendly fashion line, will be working on our fall collection coming out in September. So you can stay tuned for that, again, at tranquility.com. Then there's a link also to my 5 books, e-courses, the Tranquility du Jour podcast app, and of course, a bit about my passion for animals. If you have a moment to pen a review on iTunes and or share this podcast via social media, I would be so grateful. Or pen a review of any of my books on Amazon or Goodreads. My hope is that it ideally helps others find tranquility in their daily lives. So wishing you a delightful week ahead. And as always, thank you for being here with me at Tranquility du Jour. Namaste. Thank you.